Well, first, it's a pleasure to be here and participate in the interview. And the question is interesting because there isn't much connection, and that is actually the interesting phenomenon I find. And I came across that this gap when I did, funny enough, research, comparative research between immigration policy in Germany and Canada. And the central idea in that particular project was that um, immigration policy is closely connected to the national imagination, how a country sees itself and constructs its own identity. And I found that the Canadian national imagination is one where we say we are a country of immigrants. People can come here from the outside. It doesn't matter where they were born. It doesn't matter to whom where they were born. They can come to Canada. It might be difficult to immigrate, but eventually we can integrate into this society and become part of this multiculturalism and multicultural paradise. And that's sort of the national imagination. And that's the narrative that drives migration policy. But what is not included there is the indigenous claim to belong, which is a very different one, which is an ethnic claim to belonging. And this is exactly what this national imagination of Canada rejects. So there's a contradiction here. And I think that one of the reasons why we're not connecting immigration policy with reconciliation and indigenous kind of ways of belonging is because there is this contradiction. It is much easier to talk about immigration policy when we don't have to deal with this other issue. And the consequences that we have an immigration debate, which is taking place in that part of the room, and then and a discussion about settler colonialism and about reconciliation, which is taking place in a different corner of the room. But we're not connecting the two, even though when you look at the facts, they are very closely connected with each other. Settler colonialism is, of course, a function of immigration, and they were closely tied together with each other. So there is this factual relationship between the two that continues. But in our debate and the way that we look at it in political debate and scholarship, we don't make this connection because it doesn't fit. And rather than addressing it, it's much easier just to keep them separate. So initially, I thought it would be great to have some kind of consultation mechanism in immigration policy, which doesn't really exist. But then I also engaged with a graduate student in a research project exploring what these indigenous perspectives of migration policy are. We found that, well, first, there's not much out there. There's not much commentary from indigenous people, from indigenous leaders or voices that have anything to say about immigration policy, and partly because probably there are more important issues, clean drinking water, missing and murdered indigenous women, land theft and reclamation and things like that. So that there are more prominent issues than immigration policy. But in general, what we're finding is that there's vast support among the indigenous community of immigration. Nobody really seems to challenge, or very few voices seem to really challenge that immigration exists. So it's almost like an open borders kind of perspective that, yes, we're okay with people coming here. But when you're here, you should acknowledge settler colonialism. You should educate yourself about indigenous ways of governance, indigenous ways of belonging and culture, but then also be reflective of the settler colonialism and what it has done to the land. And then recognizing the treaties as well and being even aware of them. So that's very interesting. There's also a very interesting part of this project, and we saw some voices that also suggest that indigenous ideas of governance might not be very compatible with the Canadian nation state itself. This whole idea of the nation state, which is a European concept that was brought over here and imposed. And of course, indigenous communities have organized themselves very differently and still organize themselves very differently. So there's also this fundamental question: can reconciliation even take place within the context of the Canadian state? Right, and I think one of the another project that we explored again with conducted with graduate students was looking at the idea of sovereignty. That was sort of a follow-up project from the one that I just mentioned, because there has been a lot of talk about indigenous sovereignty in the last decade or so, and we noticed that the kind of sovereignty that we attach to the Canadian state is a very different kind of idea than when we talk about indigenous sovereignty, even though the term sovereignty is the same. When we talk about sovereignty of the Canadian state, it's really a very Westphalian, a Eurocentric kind of idea, that there's one kind of sovereign, which is the Canadian government, that has complete authority in a way over the territory of Canada, including its borders, who can cross and who doesn't. And Indigenous peoples around the world have a very different understanding what sovereignty is. It's much more acknowledging of these connections between people, between land and spirituality that is attached to the land, and animals and other living beings that are on the land. There's much more acknowledging this interdependency, which is very different from the Canadian state sovereignty, which says, well, no, there's nothing interdependent. It's just the Canadian state that is sovereign. And Indigenous sovereignty is also very contextualized, meaning that what an Indigenous sovereignty might mean in Canada is something else than what it might mean in another settler country like Australia, or something else in Africa or in Asia. So it's not just one kind of idea that is imposed on the rest of the world, like the state idea. Indigenous sovereignty is much more contextualized, much more acknowledging of these relationships between different independent decision makers. So there's also this fundamental different understanding of what does it mean to be sovereign as a community. Right, and absolutely. And I think I'm just going to pick it up from the previous discussion where we talked about sovereignty, and especially state sovereignty. And the way that migration globally is governed today is really through that nation-state lens. There's a state that claims I'm sovereign, and therefore I can determine who can cross the border and who can't, and under what conditions. And that is really a very kind of an unintuitive way of regulating migration. It's very inclusive and exclusive. Either you get a visa or you don't get a visa. It's an arbitrary decision-making process. Often it's very unfair from a social justice viewpoint, and so forth. Then there are these gradients that some people are allowed to be citizens, others are just invited as guests. Refugees have to leave at one point again, not in Canada, but in other countries. So there's all these conditions that the nation state imposes. And when you look at cities, you find that cities have a very different approach. It doesn't matter where you come from when you come to a city, and that actually connects in interesting ways to this Indigenous perspective. Mm-hmm. If I live in Toronto, and if you move from Victoria to Toronto, Toronto would not say, "Oh, you have to apply for a visa first, and then we assess you based on your human capital or whatever." Right? You can come, and that's sort of the standard for and relocate to Toronto, and that's sort of the standard model for cities. It doesn't matter where you come from; you come to cities, and then once you live within our boundaries, then it's our job to make sure that you have your services, that your kids can go to school, that you have recreational facilities available to you, that you can go to hospitals and so forth. And there's not really, from an urban kind of perspective and looking from the city's perspective, a distinction between what kind of papers you have. It's just a matter of, you live here within our boundary, you need to see a doctor, you need to be able to go to the police if you have a problem and so forth, and not be fearful of deportation. So it's a very different approach, and it's not an approach, this urban approach is not based on this idea of sovereignty, but much more on solidarity, that we are, as an urban community, we act in solidarity to each other, we support each other. And we find that approach not only in Canada, in Canada and the US, we talk about sanctuary cities, for example, that support migrants without national status, where the state says, "Oh, we don't really want you here in this country," but cities have exactly that approach. Well, you're here, we have to deal with your children, sending them to school. You have to provide services for you. And this kind of solidarity approach we find actually around the world at the urban scale. In Europe, there are many cities that have this kind of solidarity-based approach. We also have a project, I'm leading a project that is now also looking in Latin America and in Africa, and we find these approaches as well. They are not always called solidarity city approaches, and they appear in a very different kind of labels and frames, but the general idea is that within an urban community, you have some degree of connection because the people actually live there and they know each other. And you're not an abstract person. You are a real person. You are a neighbor. You are the parent of children that go to school with my children. So it's this personal connection that makes a difference. And we observe that really almost everywhere in the world. And it's a very different approach to connecting to people as this national sovereignty-based approach. When we look at North America, where we started with this project, it's really this connection between sort of the municipality, the top-down approach, and then also activism and civil society organizations, sort of a bottom-up approach, and they kind of connect with each other in the political arena. That model is not. It kind of replicates itself in other areas, but in Latin America, for example, we find that there might be leadership much more from a bottom-up approach in civil society organizations. In other contexts, we find that there might be more leadership from the municipality in terms of declarations towards support of migrants and so forth. So it is not one standard, one-fits-all model, but somehow there are multiple players connecting in this sanctuary city idea or solidarity city idea. I do have a sense that this conflict between the municipal approach and the national approach is going to be much more prominent starting with the second Trump administration. And in the first Trump administration, we already saw that the mayor at the time of New York was having these exchanges, de Blasio, having these exchanges with the Trump administration. And I expect that this conflict is going to be increasing significantly. And how these politics are going to play out, I don't know how it exactly is going to unfold. But I think it's going to be becoming much more prominent, and the public is going to be much more aware of the idea of solidarity cities, sanctuary cities, and then the national government's approach towards deportations in particular.